Every few years, somebody declares the old-school four-wheel drive dead. Too rugged for modern roads, too thirsty for modern fuel prices, too simple for a generation raised on touchscreens. And yet drive through the Australian outback, the Sahara, or the Andes, and you will still find them working. Not restored, not babied, just running, because nobody ever taught them how to quit. Today we are counting down 10 Japanese four-wheel drives that were never designed to last forever. Engineers just forgot to build in a way for them to stop. Stick around for number 1. It is the four-wheel drive. Every other one on this list still gets measured against. Number 10. Suzuki Escudo/Sidekick. In Japan, they called it the Escudo. In North America, Suzuki and General Motors badged it the Sidekick, and it very nearly killed the brand before this four-wheel drive ever got the chance to prove anything. In 1988, Consumer Reports published a rollover warning so damaging that Suzuki spent the next decade fighting a lawsuit over it in American courts. Most companies would have shelved the platform entirely. Suzuki kept building it anyway, right alongside its cousin, the Samurai, all the way through 1997. The Suzuki Escudo was developed as the next step up from the SJ series Suzuki Jimny, a slightly larger, slightly more comfortable four-wheel drive with a boxy two-door body, and later a stretched four-door version riding on a longer wheelbase. Underneath the plastic wheel arches and the soft-top roof options was a real transfer case and genuine part-time four-wheel drive, not a badge-engineered crossover pretending to be capable. That mattered because the Escudo quietly built a second life, far from American courtrooms. In Japan, Europe, and across the developing world, it became a favorite budget expedition vehicle, small enough to squeeze down narrow goat trails, light enough to winch out of mud by hand, simple enough that a roadside mechanic with basic training could keep one running with nothing more than a socket set and patience. It never had the star power of a Toyota Land Cruiser or the cult status of a Suzuki Jimny, and that is exactly why it survives in such large numbers today. Nobody thought it was special enough to hoard as a collector's piece, so it just kept doing the one job it was built for, getting somewhere rough and getting back. The Chevrolet Tracker, GMC Tracker, and Pontiac Sunrunner badges that General Motors slapped on this same platform across North America and Canada tell you how widely this four-wheel drive was distributed under different names, even while the rollover controversy dominated headlines. Meanwhile, out in the countries where nobody read that particular Consumer Reports issue, the Escudo and Sidekick simply kept working, generation after generation, as unglamorous, unkillable daily transport. Four-wheel drive examples from this era are still hauling people and cargo across terrain that would strand a modern crossover within the first 100 meters, and almost nobody driving one today has ever heard of the lawsuit that nearly ended its story before it began. It also carried the Vitara and Grand Vitara names in different markets, meaning 3 or 4 completely different badges were quietly sharing the same rugged bones across separate continents at the same time, a level of platform sharing most modern automakers would never dare attempt so openly. The 5-speed manual, low-range transfer case, and relatively light curb weight, generally in the neighborhood of a ton, meant that even the most basic entry-level trim could handle genuine off-pavement conditions without any aftermarket modification whatsoever, something few small four-wheel drives from any era can honestly claim. Did you know the Escudo Sidekick almost got sued out of existence in America? Still see one running today. Number 9. Daihatsu Taft. Daihatsu built this four-wheel drive starting in 1974 and gave it the acronym Tough and Almighty Four-Wheel Touring Vehicle, which is either the most honest marketing copy in automotive history or the most embarrassing one, depending entirely on how well the machine holds up decades later. It held up. The Daihatsu Taft was Daihatsu's answer to the Suzuki Jimny, a slightly larger, slightly more serious, mini four-wheel drive, built on a simple ladder frame with leaf springs and a 2-speed transfer case, engineered for farmers and forestry workers, rather than weekend adventurers. The earliest F10 models ran a tiny 958 cubic centimeters petrol engine that produced less power than a modern lawnmower, but that was never really the point. The point was a four-wheel drive, light enough that four people could physically lift a corner out of a ditch, and simple enough that nothing on it could fail, in a way a farmer with basic hand tools could not fix on the spot, often without ever visiting a dealership. Around 1977, the F20 arrived with a larger Toyota-sourced 1.6-litre petrol engine, and shortly after that came the F50 and F60 diesel variants, which is where the Taft truly found its export market. Farm and forestry markets across rural Europe and beyond all took to the diesel Tafts as cheap, unkillable working vehicles, and the platform proved rugged enough that Toyota itself rebadged a version of it as the Blizzard for several years, which tells you how little shame there was in borrowing a genuinely sound chassis from a smaller competitor. In Europe, coach builder Giovanni Michelotti even produced a more luxuriously equipped version, proof that the underlying engineering was flexible enough to support both farmyard duty and boutique conversions. Production wound down in 1984 as the Daihatsu Rugger took over the model line, but Taft survivors are still working in the same conditions they were built for 4 decades ago, hauling firewood and fence posts up hills that would strand a modern crossover in the first 100 meters. It never had the badge recognition of a Toyota Land Cruiser. It also never needed it, because the people who actually depended on this four-wheel drive never cared what badge was on the grille. Number 8. Mitsubishi Delica. This one is not built like the rest of the list. It is a van, and that alone gets it laughed out of most off-road conversations before it ever gets the chance to prove anything. Then people find out what is underneath it. The second-generation Mitsubishi Delica arrived in 1979 as a fairly conventional Japanese passenger van, badged the Star Wagon, and for 3 years it stayed exactly that ordinary. Then in October 1982, Mitsubishi did something nobody else in the segment was doing. It bolted a genuine part-time four-wheel drive system, borrowed directly from the early Mitsubishi Pajero chassis, underneath a tall, boxy 8-seat body. The result should not have worked as well as it did, and yet it became one of the most quietly capable overland vehicles Japan ever exported. The four-wheel drive Delica could carry a full family and their gear, climb terrain that would strand a proper sport utility vehicle, and still return to civilization in time for the school run the next morning. Diesel variants in the 2.0 to 2.5 litre range became the preferred specification for exactly this reason, delivering low-end torque for climbing steep, loose terrain, and enough fuel range to make remote overlanding a realistic proposition rather than a theoretical one. Production continued through the 1986 redesign, when the more rounded soft-cube styling arrived and the Star Wagon name carried forward until the Delica Space Gear took over in 1994, with commercial four-wheel drive variants lingering in production into 1999. Today, the Delica has become one of the most sought-after Japanese imports in North America, arriving through the 25-year import rule to a fan base that treats it less like a minivan and more like a Toyota Land Cruiser with sliding doors. Owners routinely fit long-range fuel tanks, off-road bumpers, winches, and auxiliary lighting, transforming what began as a family shuttle into a genuinely serious four-wheel drive expedition vehicle. Nobody who mocked it as just a van has ever actually driven one up a loose fire road at altitude, because the moment they do, the mockery tends to stop rather quickly. The two-wheelbase lineup, offered in both standard and long variants, meant buyers could choose between a more maneuverable footprint for tight trails or extra cabin space for genuine long-distance overlanding. A flexibility almost no other four-wheel drive van on this list ever matched. Silk Road Autos and similar specialist importers in Canada have spent close to 2 decades bringing these across the Pacific specifically, because demand from overlanding and van life communities has never meaningfully slowed down, even as the vehicles themselves approach the half-century mark. a van that outclimbs SUVs. Would you daily drive a four-wheel drive Delica? Number 7. Isuzu Trooper. Isuzu's first real attempt at a proper sport utility vehicle launched in September 1981 under the name Rodeo Bighorn in Japan. A mouthful that got trimmed down everywhere else to simply Trooper, or Bighorn in export markets that kept the original half of the name. It was a deliberately no-frills machine from the outset. A 4-cylinder engine, a 5-speed manual transmission, part-time 4-wheel drive, engaged by a simple floor-mounted shifter, and an independent front suspension that was unusually sophisticated for a body-on-frame 4-wheel drive of its era. Isuzu was not trying to out-luxury the Toyota Land Cruiser. It was trying to build something that simply worked and stayed affordable, and it succeeded well enough that General Motors, Honda, and Vauxhall all eventually rebadged this same platform under their own names just to have something to compete with in the segment. The second generation, introduced in 1991, added a V6 engine option and more creature comforts without losing the ladder frame toughness underneath. And it went on to win its class at the grueling Australian Safari Rally, 3 years running through the early 90s, proving the underlying chassis under genuine competitive pressure in one of the harshest endurance events on the planet. By 1998, a mid-life facelift brought a stronger 3.5-litre engine and a Borg-Warner torque-on-demand 4-wheel drive system, keeping the Trooper relevant right up until Isuzu finally retired it from the American market in 2002, replaced by the smaller Axiom. In the Philippines, a Skyroof Edition variant lingered in production even later, into the 2005 model year, complete with leather seats and a power moonroof for buyers who wanted the rugged reputation without giving up any comfort. In parts of the world where Isuzu never stopped selling four-wheel drives outright, Troopers built in the 80s are still doing daily work today, largely because there was never a compelling reason to overcomplicate what was already a straightforward, field-repairable four-wheel drive system. The Trooper's badge engineering reach was genuinely remarkable for a vehicle nobody outside enthusiast circles talks about today. Honda sold it as the Horizon in Japan, Opel and Vauxhall sold it as the Monterey across Europe and the United Kingdom, Holden sold it as the Jackaroo in Australia, and Acura sold a version as the SLX in North America, meaning a single Isuzu engineering effort quietly propped up half a dozen unrelated dealership lineups at once. The Trooper won its class at the Australian Safari 3 years straight. Underrated, tough four-wheel drive. Number 6. Mitsubishi Pajero. First and second generation. Before it was a Montero in the Americas, or a Shogun in the United Kingdom, it was simply the Mitsubishi Pajero, launched in Japan in May 1982, after debuting as a concept at the Tokyo Motor Show the previous October. Mitsubishi built it to go directly after the Toyota Land Cruiser and the Range Rover, and rather than out-luxury either one, it went a genuinely different route. Coil springs instead of leaf springs, for a more controlled ride over rough terrain, adjustable suspension settings, and a part-time four-wheel drive system that could compete seriously off-road while staying comfortable enough for daily use on paved roads. That combination is exactly why the Pajero became the vehicle to beat at the Paris-Dakar Rally, an event it would go on to win more times than any other vehicle in the race's entire history, a record that still stands. The second generation arrived in January 1991 with rounder, more city-friendly styling, the introduction of Mitsubishi's Super Select four-wheel drive system, and a V6 engine lineup that grew as large as 3.5 litres by 1993. This is the generation most enthusiasts picture when they think classic Pajero, boxy but modern, tough but genuinely livable as a daily family vehicle. Production of this era continued until 1999, when the third generation moved to a monocoque body with a built-in ladder frame, closing out an era of body-on-frame simplicity that off-road purists still prefer today. Decades of Dakar-honed engineering trickled straight down into the ordinary road-going Pajero, which is exactly why so many first and second generation examples remain working four-wheel drives in Africa, South America, and the Middle East today, hauling people and cargo across terrain. The rally versions were originally built to survive. The first generation platform was even licensed to Hyundai, which built it as the Galloper well into the 2000s, extending this engineering's working life even further beyond Mitsubishi's own production run. Long wheelbase and short wheelbase body styles were offered side by side throughout both generations, giving buyers the option of a nimble, short overhang 3-door for technical trails, or a longer 5-door wagon for genuine family duty, without ever forcing a compromise between the two. That same flexibility is a big part of why the Pajero built such a broad, genuinely global following, rather than settling into a single narrow niche the way many of its rivals eventually did. Most Dakar rally wins of any vehicle ever built. Did you know that about the Pajero? Number 5. Toyota 4. Runner/Hilux Surf. When the Toyota Land Cruiser FJ40 stopped being sold in the United States in the early 80s, one Wisconsin dealership owner refused to accept that American buyers would simply have nowhere to go. He worked with Winnebago to convert the Hilux pickup into a rough 4-passenger camper called the Trekker, and Toyota was watching closely enough that the idea became a factory-built production vehicle within a few years. The result, launched for the 1984 model year, was a 2-door 4-wheel drive, built on the humble Hilux pickup platform, complete with a removable fiberglass shell over the rear cargo area and a rear window that could be rolled down flat into the tailgate. In Japan and export markets, it was sold under a completely different name, the Hilux Surf, a badge that continued in production there until 2009, years after the 4 Runner name had already moved through several very different generations in North America. The second generation, arriving for 1990, dropped the removable top for a proper one-piece roof and coil-sprung rear suspension, moving the vehicle firmly from converted pickup toward genuine sport utility vehicle. What never changed underneath the reshaping bodywork was the fundamental body-on-frame toughness, borrowed directly from the Hilux, the same pickup platform already proven across deserts and conflict zones worldwide. That shared DNA is exactly why early 4-wheel drive, 4Runners and Hilux Surfs are still climbing trails decades after their model years ended, often on their original drivetrains, with nothing more than routine maintenance keeping them going. The first and second generation examples in particular have developed an outsized following among overlanders, specifically because they combine genuine Hilux-grade mechanical simplicity with an actual back seat and a real cargo area, a combination the pickup version alone never offered. The removable fiberglass shell itself became something of a signature quirk, heavy enough that 2 people were usually needed to lift it off, yet popular enough among period buyers that Toyota kept offering it as a distinguishing feature, well after rival manufacturers had already moved to fix steel roofs across their own comparable SUV lineups. Toyota has kept the nameplate in continuous production ever since, now 6 generations deep, but it is those earliest, simplest 4-wheel drives that off-road purists still point to as the moment Toyota figured out how to build something as tough as a Land Cruiser without the Land Cruiser price tag attached to it. That original formula, proven mechanicals wrapped in just enough extra practicality to win over an actual family, turned out to be a template Toyota would return to again and again across the decades that followed, long after the last removable fiberglass shell had been bolted onto a factory assembly line. Built from a Hilux priced under a Land Cruiser. Did you know the 4Runner started life as a Wisconsin dealer's camper conversion? Number 4. Suzuki Jimny/Samurai, SJ Series. In 1988, Consumer Reports ran a rollover test on this exact platform's American export, the Suzuki Samurai, and the resulting controversy is still cited today as one of the most damaging consumer safety stories a small automaker has ever survived. Suzuki fought the finding in court for over a decade and eventually won a partial retraction, but by then the damage to American sales figures was already done. What almost nobody outside enthusiast circles noticed was that the underlying SJ platform never actually needed defending on engineering merit, because everywhere outside the United States, it kept selling and kept working exactly as designed. The SJ series launched in 1981 as a genuinely tiny, genuinely serious four-wheel drive. A rigid ladder frame, solid axles, front and rear, and a low-range transfer case squeezed into a vehicle barely larger than a modern hatchback. The SG413 arrived in 1984 with a larger 1.3-liter engine and became the version most people recognize today as the Samurai once it reached American showrooms in 1985. Lightweight was the entire engineering philosophy behind this four-wheel drive. A stock SJ weighs barely over 1,700 pounds, which means it floats over sand and mud that would bog down a heavier four-wheel drive. And when it does get genuinely stuck, 4 people can realistically lift a corner out by hand. The SJ line ran until 1998, when the JB23 generation replaced it, but by then the Samurai and Jimny had already built a global reputation among hardcore off-roaders that the rollover panic never managed to fully erase. Well beyond what Suzuki's own Japanese production numbers suggest, it remains one of the most heavily modified and rock-crawled small four-wheel drives on the planet, decades after Suzuki technically stopped building it in its original form. Number 3. Nissan Patrol Y60/Y61. Outside Japan, this is the four-wheel drive the Safari badge actually represents, and it built its reputation in some of the least forgiving environments on the planet. The Y60 generation launched in 1987 as Nissan's first coil-sprung Patrol, replacing the older leaf-sprung 160 series with a fully coiled solid axle setup that dramatically improved wheel articulation without sacrificing the load capacity a genuinely working four-wheel drive needs. The 4.2-liter TD42 diesel inline-6 became the engine most closely associated with the badge, prized for its mechanical simplicity, its total lack of electronic engine management to eventually fail, and its ability to run on questionable fuel quality without complaint in places where premium diesel simply does not exist. That combination made the Y60 Patrol the default choice for aid convoys, desert militaries, and long-range overlanders across the Middle East, Africa, and Australia through the 1990s, markets where a Toyota Land Cruiser might have carried more prestige, but the Patrol often carried more genuine loyalty among people who actually depended on it every single day. The Y61 generation arrived in 1997, and, unlike its Japanese domestic market Safari sibling, which was retired in Japan in 2007, the Patrol name kept selling in other export markets for years afterward, particularly across the Middle East, where the Y61 remained available. New well into the 2000s, eventually running past 2013 in some markets before the newer Y62 finally took over the badge. That extraordinarily long production tail is not a fluke. It reflects a region where buyers explicitly wanted the older solid axle simplicity over the Y62's more complex, more comfortable, and considerably less field repairable platform. A Patrol built in the late 80s and one built 2 decades later share enough underlying mechanical DNA that spare parts and repair knowledge cross generations with almost no friction, which is precisely the kind of long-term reliability that keeps fleets running for decades on the same basic parts bin. In markets like Australia, the Patrol built such an entrenched following that it became a genuine rival to the Toyota Land Cruiser in local sales figures, an outcome almost nobody would have predicted when the coil-sprung Y60 first replaced the older leaf-sprung 160 series back in 1987. That rivalry, playing out across some of the harshest and most remote driving conditions on the planet, is a large part of why both nameplates carry the weight they still do among serious overlanding communities today. The Y61 Patrol was still being sold new well past 2013 in some markets. Did you know it outlived its own JDM Safari twin by that much? Number 2. Toyota Hilux. There is a reason a well-known television crew once spent an entire episode trying and failing to destroy one of these on purpose, and it is not because the four-wheel drive simply got lucky on camera. The Toyota Hilux launched in 1968 as a compact, no-nonsense pickup, and across more than half a century of continuous production, Toyota has never once strayed far from the core formula that made it work in the first place. A simple body-on-frame chassis, a genuinely bulletproof 4-cylinder or straight-six engine, and part-time four-wheel drive that does exactly what it is asked to do without any unnecessary complexity left to fail. That reputation was not built in a laboratory. It was built across decades of actual field use in nearly every conflict zone, disaster response effort, and impassable trade route on the planet. Militia forces, aid organizations, and mining operations from the Sahara to the Australian outback have all independently converged on the same conclusion over the decades. When a four-wheel drive absolutely has to keep running with minimal maintenance in the worst possible conditions, it is almost always a Hilux parked at the front of the convoy. The diesel variants from the 80s and 90s in particular, running Toyota's L Series and later the 3L and 5L engines, have become the default choice for anyone building a genuine expedition vehicle, rather than simply buying a lifestyle accessory to park in a driveway. What makes the Hilux remarkable is not any single technical innovation, because there genuinely is not one standout feature to point to. It is the deliberate, disciplined absence of anything unnecessary. Every generation, Toyota builds strips complexity away, rather than adding it, which runs precisely backwards from where most of the industry has moved over the same decades, and that discipline is exactly why this four-wheel drive keeps outliving whatever is supposed to eventually replace it in the lineup. Peacekeeping forces and humanitarian convoys across dozens of countries have standardized on the Hilux specifically because spare parts and mechanically literate labor are available almost everywhere on Earth, an unglamorous logistics advantage that matters far more in practice than horsepower figures ever could. Toyota itself has leaned into that reputation rather than running from it, continuing to build the current generation on essentially the same body-on-frame philosophy the very first 1968 model established, even as nearly every other manufacturer in the segment has moved toward unibody construction. The four-wheel drive a TV show couldn't destroy on purpose. What's the toughest thing you've seen a Hilux survive? Number 1, Toyota Land Cruiser, FJ40 through 100 series. Every single four-wheel drive on this list has been measured against this one, whether the script said so directly or not, and that is not an accident of countdown structure. It is simply the truth of how this entire segment has worked since 1960. The FJ40 launched that year as a deliberately Spartan machine. An exposed steel dashboard, fold-down jump seats, a short wheelbase, and a straight-six engine built to run for hundreds of thousands of miles with nothing more than basic, field-level maintenance. Toyota kept building it with only incremental changes for over 2 decades, right through 1984 in most markets, at which point the 70 series took over the heavy-duty role, while the more comfortable 60 series, launched in 1980, pushed the nameplate toward the family sport utility market that would eventually come to define the entire segment. The 60 series gave way to the 80 series in 1990, which brought genuine full-time four-wheel drive, and for the first time, a level of comfort that let the Land Cruiser compete directly against genuine luxury sport utility vehicles, without giving up an inch of the mechanical toughness underneath the body. That unbroken lineage continued through the 100 series, introduced in 1998 and produced through 2007, the last generation before independent front suspension arrived on later models, and purists began drawing a firm line between the old solid axle four-wheel drives and everything that came after them. What actually ties nearly 5 decades of Land Cruisers together, from a 1962 FJ40 to a 2007 100 series, is not styling continuity or badge recognition. It is the simple, undeniable fact that Toyota's engineers, working in 1960, made decisions so fundamentally sound that these four-wheel drives are still working today in conditions that would strand almost anything built to a modern comfort standard, and they are doing it on essentially the same basic mechanical logic. The company settled on more than 60 years ago, largely unchanged in its underlying philosophy, even as the bodywork evolved around it. Militaries, aid organizations, and remote research expeditions on every inhabited continent have leaned on this exact lineage for the same fundamental reason. When failure is not an option, and the nearest dealership is 1,000 miles away, the Land Cruiser has simply never given anyone a serious reason to look elsewhere. 10 four-wheel drives, 4 decades, one country that quietly figured out how to build things that refuse to quit. If your family ever owned one of these, or still does, tell me which one down in the comments. And if you want to see which old military four-wheel drives outlasted their own armies, that countdown is linked right here.